Nicholas. The very last Russian Tsar was born Nikolai Alexandrovich Romanov in 1868 just outside St. Petersburg. The last of the Romanov Dynasty, he was descended on his father's side from Anna Petrova, the daughter of Peter the Great, although his ancestry was mainly Danish and German. Famously, he was not only cousins with Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, but also King George V of Great Britain, all of them being grandchildren of the late great Queen Victoria, who did an awful lot of lovemaking for a woman who resembled a teapot that had fallen on its side. I guess it was her job, though, being a monarch and everything, and who could forget her famous sex advice? I just close my eyes and think of England. Anyway, don't ask me how any of this worked, but Queen Victoria's children and grandchildren all became kings or princes or dukes or whatever in all these different countries. They even got together from time to time to play dress-up in one another's military uniforms. Pretty goddamn weird if you ask me, but what do I know? The point is, Tsar Nicholas was totally unprepared when his father suddenly died, thrusting him onto the throne. At the time, he was only 26 years old. His entire education in life up to that point consisted of riding horses, playing dress-up, and memorizing the tables of rank and lineage for various Russian nobles. Running an industrialized nation this way is a little like putting the Pope in charge of NASA, since he knows the most about heaven. Nicholas II's reign began ominously. At his coronation ceremony in Moscow, someone had the bright idea to hand out free beer and sausages to the spectators. But since we are in Russia, rumors spread they were running out, a stampede ensued, and over 1,000 people were crushed to death. This basically sums up his reign. The guy just couldn't do anything right. Much like the doomed Louis XVI before him, Tsar Nicholas was as much a victim as he was a cause of the events that would shortly engulf all of Russia. To be honest, there were some good qualities to the man. Unlike a distant great-great-great-great-grandmother of his, who may have been left unsupervised with a horse once too often, Nicholas II was first and foremost a family man, deeply religious and devoted to his wife and children. For a few good years there, the Russian royal family enjoyed something of a fairy tale life, summering in sumptuous palaces, dancing the night away at elegant balls, the likes of which the world will never see again, and chumming around with all those royal cousins of theirs, all while sinister, thickly laid forces were driving Europe, and Russia in particular, towards the brink of catastrophe. Although Nicholas's competent but often frustrated and underappreciated ministers, Sergei Witt and Pyotr Stolypin, pleaded with Nicholas to embrace the mildest of reforms, the Tsar remained obstinate. It's not so much he was indifferent to the suffering and complaints of the Russian people. It was rather that he was incomparably stupid, ideologically blinded by his grand vision of autocracy and stubbornly convinced that he knew best. Gee, I've never heard that one before.
I'm not going to shut down the country, but I'm going to shut down the virus.
Trouble was afoot in Russia. The Social Democrats in the cities and the Socialist Revolutionaries in the countryside were animated and agitated. Mass demonstrations had become a frequent occurrence, yet Tsar Nicholas waved them all away, serenely convinced the bulk of ordinary Russians adored him. What Russia really needed, he came to believe, was a jolly good old-fashioned war. It had been a while, he figured, and so he marched Russia off to the Far East, looking to stir up trouble. He found it, not with China, as he expected, but with the young, hungry nation of Japan, who, to be fair, was also looking to stir up trouble. In 1904, Russia was stunned by the news that the Japanese had pulled off a surprise attack on their Pacific Fleet. Sound familiar at all? And angrily responded by sending the Baltic Fleet all the way around the world to teach those goddamn sandal wearers a lesson. A lesson was learned, all right, but not the one Russia had in mind. For the moment it arrived, the Russian fleet was annihilated by the Japanese fleet at the Battle of the Tsushima Strait, one of the most complete victories in the annals of war. This event, the total defeat of a European power by an Asian power, was as much an ecstatic triumph for Japan as it was a crippling humiliation for Russia. Never before had the Russian state seemed so feeble or brittle. This would have consequences. In St. Petersburg, a non-deviant Russian priest drafted a petition to the Tsar for badly needed reforms and led a crowd of supporters to the Winter Palace. Ironically, neither Father Gapon nor most Russian workers in general at that time were part of any formal socialist movement. Their aims were more limited and laudable. Better working conditions, universal suffrage, and an end to the disastrous Russo-Japanese War. The marchers approached the palace holding religious icons and waving patriotic banners and singing "God Save the Tsar," but were cornered in several places by Cossack soldiers who fired blindly into the crowd, killing hundreds.
We come in peace!
This incident, remembered as Bloody Sunday, aroused the reform movements into action. The Tsar was denounced, a general strike was declared, and the demand was made for a democratic republic. This was also the first time that the Soviets appeared in large numbers. The word Soviet in Russian simply means council, which is what they were. Small grassroots organizations of workers in various professions who met to decide and implement local political activities. Very few of the Soviets at this time were strictly Marxist or even socialist, which is perhaps why they mainly agreed to Tsar Nicholas's tentative reforms, namely the creation of the Duma, or national legislature. The SDs and the SRs, being socialists, quite naturally rejected these reforms, and the resulting disunion played into the hands of the arch-conservatives. Cooler heads ultimately prevailed, and the attempted revolution of 1905 ended with a compromise. Still, it was a near-run thing. Whatever Russia's difficulties in the early years of the 20th century, they would pale in comparison to the crucible that lay before them. So far, Tsar Nicholas and the teetering Russian state had narrowly managed to avoid collapse. But they could not evade the titanic cataclysm that was about to overwhelm Europe and determine the fates of billions yet unborn. To what exactly am I referring? Oh, just a tiny incident in history. You might have heard about it. Something called World War I. Tell me if this makes any sense at all. There was once a country called Austria-Hungary that had 2 kings, 2 capitals, 17 different languages, but only a single foreign policy which just so happened to be utterly fucking retarded. It all revolved around this place called Bosnia, one of the Yugoslav countries, that patchwork quilt of small Balkan kingdoms, long oppressed by the Ottoman Empire and only recently made independent. In 1908, Austria-Hungary decides to annex Bosnia into its complicated empire, much to the displeasure of most Bosnians and the neighboring Yugoslav nation of Serbia. In July 1914, a man with a funny hat and a funny name goes on a tour of Sarajevo, the Bosnian capital, where he is shot and killed by a Bosnian nationalist with an even funnier name, but no hat. Well, it was like throwing a firecracker into a room packed with dynamite. Each tiny spark threatening to light the fuse of the long-standing, highly volatile European situation. Despite no evidence whatsoever of Serbian complicity in the assassination, Austria-Hungary blamed them anyway and delivered an ultimatum comprised of 10 increasingly humiliating concessions. Then, to the surprise of everyone, the famously stubborn Serbs agreed to most of these concessions, all except for the last one, which would have essentially wiped them off the map. Not good enough, said Austria-Hungary, and they declare war on Serbia. Serbia quite naturally declares war on Austria-Hungary and appeals to help from Russia, specifically Tsar Nicholas, who had always proclaimed himself to be the great benefactor of the Slavic peoples. Russia mobilizes her army, which prompts Austria-Hungary to appeal for help from its great ally, Germany, who thenceforth declares war on Russia. Russia declares war on Germany, Austria-Hungary declares war on Russia, and Russia declares war on Austria-Hungary. All this triggering an alliance signed between Russia and France, France in which one would come to the aid of the other if Germany ever declared war on either, which it did. So France declares war on Germany. Germany declares war on France, then invades France through Belgium, which is neutral, but under the protection of Great Britain, who also declares war on Germany. Germany declares war on Great Britain, and by that point, everyone is royally, indisputably fucked. So Russia heads off to war, and right away they suffer a debacle of typical Russian proportions. Despite outnumbering the Germans nearly 5-1 at the start of the war, they lose 2 whole armies in 2 days at the disastrous Battle of Tannenberg. The Russian war effort goes downhill from there. With but one exception, the Imperial Russian Army proves itself hopelessly outmatched by the better trained, better organized, and far better equipped German army. Her advantages in manpower are tragically squandered in battle after battle as enormous numbers of poorly armed, mostly illiterate peasants are repeatedly thrown against fortified entrenchments to be butchered like swine. By 1916, nearly every Russian family could name at least one man or boy killed in a ferocious war of unprecedented scale over what was, to most, some distant, incomprehensible dispute. The Russian authorities tried to gin up patriotism. They even renamed St. Petersburg to Petrograd in order to make it sound more Russian, which is a little as if the United States changed Los Angeles to Angleton to make it sound more American. Of course, the war places an enormous strain upon Russian agriculture, industry, and society. Most of all, the war pushes the Russian state to the breaking point, and in 1917, the state finally cracks. The Russian Revolution, for so long carefully schemed by various socialist interests, instead spontaneously arises out of a far more mundane crisis, a lack of bread. The Russian people had had it with their Tsar and the Byzantine bureaucracy of the state, but as with any revolution, what needs to go is usually plain and obvious. What to replace it with is another question altogether. And tragically for the Russians, what they chose, or really what was forced on them, was the then brand spanking new theory of communism. By early 1917, the Russian state was crumbling into ruin. Her demoralized armies were on the brink of mutiny, her industries strained to the breaking point, and her people starving from incompetent food rationing. To make matters worse, the ever-delusional Tsar Nicholas had decided to personally lead the Russian forces and was away at the front making a mess of things. The Tsarina was left minding the store in his absence, and boy oh boy was that a mistake. German-born, stubborn as a mule, and sullied by that whole unsavory Rasputin business, the Tsarina was about as popular as Hillary Clinton at a monster truck rally. Finally, in February, protests erupted throughout Petrograd. The largest and most famous of these were the bread riots, in which 250,000 Russian women took to the streets, demanding not communism but food for their hungry children. Much like the Women's March of the French Revolution, this dramatic episode proved to be the turning point. When women move, men will follow. We really have no choice in the matter. Just ask Gladys why we have to visit her blabbermouth brother every goddamn Christmas. Anyway, these bread riots snowballed into what became known as the February Revolution. A little confusing as it actually took place in March, owing to the fact the Russian Orthodox Church refused to adopt the Gregorian calendar, which they regarded as yet another Illuminati conspiracy, which in all likelihood it probably is. Tsar Nicholas, in his infinite wisdom, wired the local commander and told him to disperse the crowds at gunpoint. However, unlike 1905, on this occasion the soldiers of the Petrograd garrison held their fire. Supposedly, at one moment, a young girl walked right up to a rather fearsome Cossack cavalryman and offered him a flower, which he accepted with a smile and a nod. Whether this story is fact or fiction, the simple truth was the soldiers were no longer impressed by the Tsar's authority. Most of their officers fled, some were caught and shot, but by and large, the uprising was not nearly so bloody as it could have been. It was also moving at a frenetic pace. In the span of about a week, the State Duma began calling itself the Provisional Committee and assumed control of Petrograd. Meanwhile, the Soviets of Petrograd and Moscow stirred back to life and were soon assembling into a body called the Congress of Soviets. Administrative power was rapidly draining away from the state bureaucracy and flowing directly into these new organizations. Tsar Nicholas, finally realizing the magnitude of the crisis, boarded a train and rushed back to the capital. Who knows what was on his mind or what he intended to do, for the train never reached Petrograd. Revolutionaries had seized control of most of the railway stations, so the imperial train stopped, turned around, and then stopped again. There, on March 2nd, 1917, the Tsar was informed the army could no longer support him and was advised to abdicate. Tsar Nicholas signed the papers that very day. Thus, the once imperious Russian Tsardom, the unquestioned rulers of this strange, colossal country for almost 500 years, died with the quietest of whimpers. In the end, Nicholas simply threw in the towel. Indeed, he seemed to accept his fate with a measure of contrition and dignity that perhaps goes some way towards mollifying his otherwise unfavorable reputation. All he wanted, he told his bodyguards, now his jailers, was for his wife and children to join him, which they shortly did. The Bolshevik fleet began firing into the city. Meanwhile, Lenin's paramilitary outfit of Red Guards hurriedly seized government buildings and stormed the Winter Palace, where the provisional government was headquartered. After securing the place relatively easily, they then went around trashing things and got hammered on 400-year-old bottles of vodka they found in the cellar. Now then, on to the Russian Civil War, and boy was it bonkers. As mentioned, the Bolsheviks did not yet fully control the country. The shock of the humiliating treaty with Germany, combined with tales of Bolshevik atrocities, inspired many former Tsarist officers and soldiers to organize themselves into a resistance. These were your whites.
Don't stop believing.
I know Lenin moved the government to Moscow at some point, and then you had a whole bunch of armored trains. What else? The Western Allies sent forces to aid the whites, to little avail. Massacre of the Jews. By the whites, actually. Massacre of basically everybody by the Reds. Several million dead, famine, death, devastation. Oh, and then there was Tsar Nicholas. Almost forgot about him. Fearful that the whites might try to rescue the former Tsar, the order came down to eliminate him. And so early one morning, Nicholas and his family, including his young children, were herded into a dark, dingy cellar and riddled with a hail of bullets. So ended the Romanov Dynasty. Do you see what I mean about Russian history making you want to blow your brains out?